June 26, 1944. Helandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The checkers game sat unfinished as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald looked up from the board. The rumble of engines outside the operations hut had drawn his attention, growing louder until the entire room trembled. He rose slowly, pushing back his chair as a C-47 transport roared low overhead, its landing lights slicing through the afternoon haze. Moments later, the aircraft taxied to a halt at the far edge of the strip. Mechanics and intelligence officers began to gather, word spreading quickly that something unusual had arrived. Macdonald stepped out into the heavy tropical air, the smell of oil and salt thick on the wind. Beyond the hangars, silhouetted against the jungle hills, stood the reason for all the commotion: a captured Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. The plane looked ghostly under the bright sun, its faded green paint chipped and scorched, the imperial rising sun still faintly visible on the tail. The aircraft had been flown here under guard after a forced landing on an abandoned strip in the northern islands. Somehow, it had survived almost intact. For Macdonald and his team of U.S. Army Air Force engineers, the opportunity was extraordinary. Few Allied personnel had ever seen a Betty bomber up close, let alone one in flyable condition. It was a chance to examine Japan's mainstay medium bomber, the same type that had devastated Allied positions across the Pacific and carried Admiral Yamamoto to his death the year before. But as the Americans began their inspection, one question quickly replaced curiosity: how could such an aircraft be so fragile? Macdonald walked around the fuselage slowly, his hand brushing against the thin aluminum skin. It felt alarmingly delicate, almost like the hull of a racing plane. The ground crews began taking notes: rivet spacing, engine serials, turret configuration, until one mechanic called out from beneath the wing, "Sir, you might want to see this." The lieutenant colonel knelt down beside him. The fuel tank access panel was open, and inside there was nothing. No armor plating, no self-sealing lining, just a bare aluminum tank, the kind that would ignite from a single tracer round. Macdonald frowned. "You're telling me this thing flies combat missions like this?" The mechanic nodded. "Yes, sir, no protection at all." The realization spread through the team like wildfire. The Betty's long-range capabilities came at a deadly cost: sacrificed armor for fuel capacity. That explained the countless reports from Pacific pilots describing how Japanese bombers would burst into flames after just a few hits. The one-shot lighters, as American airmen called them, weren't exaggerating. Macdonald stepped back, looking at the plane with a mix of respect and disbelief. The Japanese had built a bomber that could fly farther and faster than most of its Allied counterparts, but at the price of its crew's lives. As the sun dipped below the New Guinea mountains, the captured Betty sat quietly at the edge of the airfield, its engines cooling in the humid dusk. The Americans had come expecting to learn from their enemy's design. Instead, they had uncovered a tragic symbol of Japan's desperate gamble for range over protection, and a mystery that would leave even the best engineers shaking their heads. June 27, 1944, Helandia Air Base. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when the Betty's engines coughed to life. Two Japanese-designed Mitsubishi Kase 14-cylinder radials, rebuilt and tuned by American mechanics, rumbled unevenly, sending blue smoke across the tarmac. Ground crews stepped back, shielding their eyes from the dust as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald watched from the edge of the strip, arms folded. The plan was simple: one short flight, just enough to assess handling, power response, and basic control layout. The Betty had been inspected, photographed, and stripped of ammunition, but no one truly trusted it. Its controls were strange, its fuel system unfamiliar, and its reputation infamous. Major Frank T. McCoy, a veteran test pilot who had flown nearly every Japanese type captured in the Pacific, climbed into the cockpit with quiet unease. He had read the reports, stories of Bettys erupting midair after a single hit, pilots trapped in blazing wreckage, crews abandoning missions over the ocean rather than risk return fire. Now, sitting in the left seat of one, he could see why. The cockpit was cramped and primitive, with wiring exposed along the sidewalls and control levers painted in flaking Japanese characters. There was no armor behind the pilot's seat, no bulletproof glass, and the floor was little more than thin sheet metal. "It's like sitting inside a gas tank," McCoy muttered. Macdonald leaned in from outside the hatch. "Just keep it low and steady. Bring her back in one piece." The props bit into the air, the twin engines roaring to full power. The Betty rolled forward, gaining speed faster than expected. Despite her fragility, she was light, frighteningly light. At 85 knots, McCoy eased back on the yoke, and the bomber lifted smoothly into the New Guinea sky. From the ground, the silhouette looked almost graceful, its long, slender wings slicing through the humid air. But inside, McCoy was sweating. Every vibration rattled the cockpit. Every gust of wind made the airframe groan. The instruments wavered in their housings as if held together by hope. "She flies, but barely," he reported over the radio. "Controls are soft, engines unstable at climb power. This bird wasn't built to take punishment." He circled the base once, pushing gently on the throttles. The fuel gauges flickered. Then, for a second, the right engine sputtered, just enough to send a jolt of fear through him. McCoy throttled back immediately. A few more minutes in the air and he decided he'd learned enough. When the Betty touched down, the ground crews cheered half-heartedly. The aircraft had survived its first American flight. But as McCoy climbed out, his face was pale. "That's not a combat plane," he said quietly. "That's a suicide craft with wings." The engineers swarmed the aircraft again, taking fresh measurements, studying the unarmored fuselage and exposed fuel lines. The conclusions were undeniable. The Japanese had built a bomber capable of extreme range, but at a catastrophic trade-off. Every gallon of fuel carried in those unprotected tanks made it more vulnerable to enemy fire. By sunset, Macdonald wrote his first formal assessment for headquarters. The G4M's design reflects operational desperation. Performance impressive, but survivability negligible. Crew protection non-existent. As darkness fell, the Betty sat silent once more, its engines cooling in the tropical night. For the Americans, the test had provided answers, but also a haunting new respect. The Japanese hadn't built the Betty out of ignorance. They had built it because they had no choice. June 29, 1944, Helandia Air Base, Intelligence Division. Rain lashed the tin roofs of the intelligence huts as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald leaned over a table cluttered with blueprints, notes, and fuel line sketches. Around him sat engineers, interpreters, and ordnance experts. The captured Mitsubishi G4M, now stripped down to its framework, had revealed more than anyone expected. A dozen components lay neatly arranged across the room. Wing sections so thin you could bend them by hand, control cables frayed from heat, and a fuel tank that looked more like a kitchen water drum than military equipment. The men stared at it in disbelief. "They flew combat in this," one engineer muttered. "They did more than fly," Macdonald replied. "They fought with it, and died in it." Every test, every inspection led to the same conclusion. The Betty bomber had been built with one overriding priority: range. Everything else, from crew protection to structural safety, had been sacrificed. The aircraft could carry its bomb load nearly 3,000 miles without refueling, unheard of for a twin-engine bomber. But the secret was brutal simplicity. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no redundancy systems. If a single bullet punctured the fuselage near the wings, the entire aircraft could ignite in seconds. An Army Air Force intelligence officer flipped through captured Japanese manuals, translated into rough English. In the margins, a phrase appeared again and again: "Speed and range are defense." It was the essence of Japan's wartime aviation philosophy. Strike fast from far away, before the enemy can strike back. For the Imperial Navy, this meant long-range bombers that could reach Allied bases scattered across the Pacific. Protection was a luxury they couldn't afford, not with limited aluminum, engines, and fuel. Macdonald tapped the edge of the table thoughtfully. They built a bomber to fit their war, not ours. He wasn't wrong. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, its airfields carved into jungle islands with barely enough resources to service a handful of aircraft. Each plane had to travel extraordinary distances to hit Allied convoys and retreat before interception. The Betty was the perfect weapon for that kind of war, until American radar, fighters, and range finally caught up. A mechanic entered the hut, dripping rainwater from his flight cap. "Sir, the second tank we drained today. The fuel lines wrapped in paper insulation. No armor, no rubber seal." The room fell silent. Paper. The Japanese had insulated their fuel lines with paper. It was not madness. It was necessity. Japan's wartime industry was collapsing under shortages. Every pound of metal saved from one aircraft meant another could be built. Every ounce of protection removed meant another 50 miles of flight range gained. Macdonald scribbled the final line of his report. The G4M exemplifies Japan's strategic psychology. Mobility through vulnerability. It is both genius and suicide made into metal. He looked out through the rain-streaked window toward the distant hangar where the Betty rested under guard. To most, it was a relic of a defeated enemy. But to him, it was something more. A message written in rivets and sacrifice. In the end, the Japanese hadn't simply built a fragile bomber. They had built a symbol of an entire nation's will to endure the impossible, no matter the cost. July 2, 1944. Helandia Air Base, Test Range. A dry wind swept across the airfield, carrying the smell of fuel and dust. The stripped-down Mitsubishi G4M stood at the far edge of the test range, its faded paint scorched from tropical sun. A row of sandbags marked the firing line. On a nearby hill, cameras and observers waited. Army engineers, ordnance officers, and a few grim-faced pilots who had seen too many of these aircraft in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald stood beside the test officer, clipboard in hand. This was the final phase of their examination. Live fire assessment. They would fire standard .50 caliber rounds into the captured bomber's fuselage and fuel tanks to document the results. Major Frank McCoy, who had flown the Betty during its test flight, lit a cigarette and watched quietly. "You won't need much," he said. "One burst'll do it." At 0900 hours, the range officer gave the order. A Browning M2 machine gun mounted on a jeep swivel opened up, sending a short, controlled burst into the Betty's port wing. The sound echoed across the hills, and within seconds the results were devastating. The first few tracers punched through the thin aluminum-like paper. Then a dull whump rippled through the airframe. Flames erupted instantly, racing along the fuel line, igniting the unsealed tank in a blinding orange flash. Within 15 seconds, the wing was engulfed. The heat shimmered across the range. Macdonald shielded his face. "Cut! Fire!" he shouted, but the inferno was already uncontrollable. The bomber burned like dry leaves, the magnesium fittings sparking white-hot, the aluminum melting into rivulets that dripped through the landing gear bays. The cameras rolled, capturing every second. By the 2-minute mark, only the center fuselage remained intact, smoke pouring from the windows where the crew once sat. A gust of wind toppled the tail section. The once proud machine, Japan's most feared long-range bomber, was reduced to twisted metal and ash. The silence that followed was heavy. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The lesson was too obvious to ignore. Major McCoy broke it first. "Now, I see why they went down so fast. We never gave 'em a chance." Macdonald nodded slowly. They never had one. The film reels would later be sent to Wright Field in Ohio, where engineers would confirm what everyone at Helandia already knew. The Betty was the most flammable aircraft ever to fly in combat. Its lack of armor, unsealed fuel tanks, and fragile structure meant that a single hit, one tracer, one incendiary, was enough to turn it into a fireball. Yet, even in ruin, the aircraft inspired a strange respect. It had carried Japan's ambitions across thousands of miles of ocean. It had fought, bombed, and bled in nearly every major battle of the Pacific. And, despite its flaws, it had been flown with courage by men who knew what a single bullet could mean. As the sun set over the range, only a blackened skeleton of the Betty remained. The metal hissed softly as it cooled. Lieutenant Colonel Macdonald walked to the wreck, notebook in hand, and quietly wrote the final line of his report. An aircraft built for reach, not survival. In it, we see the measure of a nation fighting against time and physics. He closed the notebook, turned, and walked away. Behind him, the wreckage smoldered in the fading light, a testament to ingenuity, desperation, and the terrible price of range without protection. July 5, 1944. Allied Intelligence Center, Helandia Air Base. The projector clattered softly as the final film reel flickered against the canvas screen. Grainy black and white footage showed the captured Betty bomber burning on the test range, fire consuming it in less than 2 minutes. Around the table sat senior intelligence officers, engineers, and pilots, men who had fought, chased, and been hunted by this very aircraft across the Pacific skies. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Macdonald stood at the front of the room, his uniform still dusted from the range. He waited for the reel to end before speaking. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you've just seen is the truth behind every Japanese bomber we've effaced since 1942. The G4M looks sleek, it flies fast, but it's a coffin built for distance." He clicked through photographs taken over the past week, close-ups of the fuel tanks, wiring, and armorless cockpit. No self-sealing system, no protective bulkheads, no redundancy in the hydraulics or electrics. The only defense this machine ever had, he said, pointing to the screen, was to fly farther than our fighters could reach. Until now. The room stayed quiet. For years, Allied crews had called the Betty the one-shot lighter. Now they knew just how literal that name had been. An intelligence officer took notes beside him. So, it wasn't poor design, then? It was deliberate? Macdonald nodded. Deliberate and desperate. Every ounce of metal they saved gave them another 20 miles of range. They built an aircraft to fight an empire of oceans, not a war of attrition. Across the Pacific, similar reports were already being compiled from other captured aircraft. Zero fighters, Sally bombers, Kai-43 Oscars, all telling the same story. Japan's air doctrine was built on the idea that speed and range were protection enough. When their empire stretched wide, it worked. But by 1944, the sky had changed. The Allies had the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and now the P-51 Mustang, long-range fighters that could chase the Betty all the way home. One by one, the Japanese bombers were hunted down, their long-range advantage erased. Macdonald closed his folder and looked around the table. "Gentlemen, what we saw out there wasn't just bad engineering. It was a country betting everything on hope and distance. They built these planes knowing what would happen when they were hit, and they flew them anyway." For a long moment, no one said a word. The projector whirred to a stop, the smell of burnt film filling the room. Later that evening, as the officers dispersed, Macdonald stepped outside into the humid night. The rain had stopped, and the sound of generators hummed across the base. In the distance, under a tarp near the hangars, the remains of the Betty still rested, blackened metal glinting faintly under the floodlights. He watched it for a while, remembering the reports of Japanese crews who had refused parachutes, who had flown through fire to deliver their payloads. Courage wasn't a matter of armor or engines, he thought. It was what drove a man to fly something he knew could not bring him home. When he finally turned away, the war was still raging, but the lesson of the Betty bomber would endure. The Americans had learned that victory wasn't just about better machines. It was about the choices behind them, and the price nations were willing to pay for reach, speed, and survival.